Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews podcast. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where AA members from around the world share their timeless and extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. This is our 175th interview in the AA Recovery Interviews podcast series. The success of this podcast in touching so many people's lives around the world over the past 4.5 years has been nothing short of astonishing. I invite you to revisit episode 50, the interview in which I shared my personal story. I've sought to share parts of my sobriety journey during conversations with my podcast guests over the years. But the mission of this podcast has always been to hear the whole story, especially the what it's been like part since getting sober. In the spirit of that commitment, today I'll share with you the past 4.5 years of my life since starting the podcast. To do that, dear listeners, I'm gratefully turning the microphone over to my good friend Adam M. As my very first interviewee for the podcast, it was Adam who first suggested doing an interview for episode 50 with the creator, producer, writer, editor, director, sound engineer, and host of this podcast, namely me. And now he's helping me do it again. So sit back and enjoy Adam's masterful job of interviewing me in celebration of episode 175.
My name's Adam, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Adam. My name's Howard, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Howard.
What do you think about that?
Hey, pretty good.
It's been a while since you and I have done this, hasn't it?
Since episode 50, when
episode 50.
interviewed you, and then episode 1, where you interviewed me.
Yeah, you were my inaugural episode for the podcast, and your encouragement and involvement in this project with me has meant the world to me. And you were very encouraging at places along the way where I didn't know that I wanted to, how I wanted to proceed. And you came back with a very calming influence by reminding me of the importance of doing this. And so I thank you. And it's going to be a challenge for me not to want to be the interviewer today, but leaving it entirely up to you.
Yeah, well, I know the podcast has had an impact on a lot of people. I know a lot of people I talk to regularly reference the podcast or reference someone they heard their story that maybe they'd never heard their story of before. And plus, it's this repository of wisdom and experience, strength, and hope for so many people. So, yeah. How long have you been doing the podcast?
I started doing the podcast. The very first episode was December of 2019, was it? Or
2020.
2020, right. And the very first episode was with you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's coming up on 4.5, as of the date of this particular interview, and this is number 175. That was number 1, so it's been 4.5 years.
Yeah. What were some of the challenges you faced getting this thing off the ground?
Well, some of them were kind of fundamental, that I had never put together a podcast before. Although I had done some recording and other things in the past, I didn't know how to do it. But by the time I started doing it, there were so many resources for how to do a podcast that I glommed onto them pretty quickly and found ways and workarounds, because I don't have a degree in sound engineering, or although I've done some recording over the years. It's something that, it was all brand new to me. So I kind of muddled along, and complicating things or making them less complicated, depending on how you want to think about it, was the fact that we were in the middle of COVID. And I was trying to interview people. The great thing was, because it was COVID and everybody wasn't working, or if they were at home, people had a lot more time to do the interviews, which I think is pretty cool. The downside was Zoom has always been a little bit glitchy. Mm-hmm. I've actually lost entire episodes of interviews to it, and I've had to redo them, cleaning them up when the sound quality goes down and so forth. Those have been challenges. In the beginning, there was some concern expressed by people I knew about the anonymity factor, and how could you do a podcast and interview people and keep it anonymous? And I got to explaining that so much that I decided the best thing for me to do was to produce a white paper on this whole process of doing an interview while maintaining the traditions of anonymity and making sure that people had their own privacy built into the interview. And as I look back into the history of AA and what Bill and Bob intended and what Bill wrote in the big book and in subsequent volumes about different things regarding AA, AA was never meant to be a secret organization. It was always meant to be an organization where I could say I'm in AA, but I can't say that you're in AA. So making sure that we respect and guard each other's anonymity is absolutely critical. And that wasn't hard to do with the podcast, because at the level of press, radio, and film, the chief factor of violating the anonymity is to show the picture of the person, or show them talking or responding or having their last name. Well, this is all audio, so there's no visual of you. And I'm only using your last initial. Unless you had a completely outrageous first name where everybody knew that that's the guy, that wouldn't violate any anonymity. So that was that was important. Making sure that anytime there was any mention of anything commercial, like the names of rehab centers and the names of companies people worked for, and the last names of people that my guests were talking about, that I removed all of that in post-production and editing, so that no one organization anywhere is going to be recognized. Keeps the privacy for the individual who went there and might be identified by knowing about that particular facility. It also makes sure that I'm not endorsing or lending the AA name to any outside enterprise, and certainly any treatment center or rehab is going to be an outside enterprise. So there were people who said, "Oh, you can't do this." And I said, "Well, we'll see." And it's interesting, Adam, over 175 now interviews, and I've also released, as you know, encores of 50 episodes so far, so there are really 220, 230 actual episodes of the podcast, but actual interviews, there are 175. Out of all the 175 interviews I've done, I've not had one person come back to me and say, "You know what, I got a lot of blowback from friends and people who listen to the podcast about anonymity or infringing on anybody's privacy." And I've interviewed a lot of people all over the place, but some people who are prominent in what they do for a living, sports, music, anything else, people who would be well known. But I've always kept the interviewing about their experience with alcohol, because if I'm interviewing a famous ball player or rock and roll star about their own journey, people can go online, they can go almost anywhere and get all kinds of information about that person's career and about where they grew up and blah, blah, blah. But do people know the story of them getting sober in AA? And so that actually has a twofold purpose for me. First of all, it makes sure that we're not dwelling on stuff that people could already get and not conflicting with anything that they've already heard or read about that person. But it also takes the ego in the situation down a few notches.
Yeah.
So me in asking questions, I'm not asking as a fawning fan, so to speak. And them in formulating their answers, they can really get in there and be as honest as possible without having to maintain something up to their image.
When you think about some of the concerns people expressed around anonymity, and is this somehow violating some tradition, which it's not, I know you researched that. What was some of the other feedback you got from people when you announced that you were doing this or started inviting people or releasing episodes? I know you made some announcements during the announcement portions of meetings.
Yeah, I did. And I got mostly, if not entirely, good feedback from people. Some of the feedback was kind of implicit by people's response whenever I'd ask them to do an interview. And I'd always ask if they're interested in doing it. And people would come back with any number of reasons why, if they couldn't do it, why they couldn't. And some of those spoke to some of the challenges. They're not notorious. They're known in a way that they don't want other people to be able to search them out. Traditional anonymity means you don't use somebody's last name or picture. Some of the people we're talking about was having people who are looking for them be able to find them by virtue of the podcast. Well, the thing is, people will recognize your voice, they'll recognize my voice. But I've always said that the podcast is designed and meant for people who are interested in our way of life, in getting sober and staying sober. Some people who listen who aren't in the program don't have the disease themselves. They want to listen to learn more because they've got a spouse or a child or a parent who've got issues with alcohol. This isn't Joe Rogan. You know, the guy on the street's not going to tune in to hear about the latest rant or rave. They're going to tune in because something about Alcoholics Anonymous piques their interest and curiosity, and just the human interest in other people's stories is really important.
Yeah. To your knowledge, is there another podcast that does this type? I know there's several recovery type podcasts where therapists or whatnot interview, but in terms of being a repository of people's stories like this, anyone else doing this?
As a matter of fact, AA has a Grapevine podcast that they put out there. I actually had the opportunity to be a guest on at one point. I've had both of the people who were hosts of that on my show as well. But the majority of AA podcasts, a lot of them are just about someone taped the person giving a speech at a speaker meeting, and they put that out there. There are some talk show-oriented podcasts out there. Some of them are better than others. But yeah, they're out there, and I knew that was the case, but I thought, if anybody's out there succeeding with it, then I can succeed with it. I have the experience and the background and the interest and the knowledge and all the other stuff, I think, to put out a quality show. I don't have the market cornered on good podcasts. I think the total, the number of people who've listened worldwide and the number of downloads I've had worldwide is kind of indicative. I don't know what the numbers are that other people get, but they're pretty good. I checked last night as I was preparing for this, and there have been over 600,000 plays of one or more of the podcasts.
Wow.
And there may be other podcasts that are more popular. I haven't really gone out of my way, though. I've had a lot of other podcasts, especially those run by therapists and psychologists, and other people want me to have them on my show as a way to talk about what they do. Now, the response I always give them is, did you get sober in AA, and are you in AA?
Right.
And a lot of the podcasts that are out there by people trying to tell other people how to get sober, they don't mention AA. Now, that may be because they want to stay away from mentioning it for whatever reason, but mine is the only one I know that kind of focuses in on AA itself and people's recovery in it.
Well, it seems like the idea of a speaker meeting, you go to a, Saturday night deal and a bunch of people come and some gal or guy stands up and tells his story for an hour, her story for an hour, and the advantage, I think, in the interview format is you get to sort of ask more in-depth questions. You get to sort of guide the conversation in a way that I think gives much more value to someone who's listening than sometimes you get at a speaker meeting, because it's, sometimes those are, it's hard to stand up there for an hour, has been my experience, and try to stay on course with conveying a certain message. And it seems like your interview style really helps make sure that that happens.
Yeah, I think it does, and that's intentional on my part, because it's about crafting the interview into something that's meaningful, easy to listen to, easy to understand, not pretentious. But what I've noticed is that I've interviewed people who I know their answer because I've heard it 100 times in meetings before. So I try and ask questions that get to the heart of the matter, So you tried to commit suicide, so
right.
What were the feelings after that, instead of I just did it and then I got sober and everything's great. The other thing is, and this has been something that's followed through the entire time, I want to spend a little bit more time about the present day and the days from sobriety up to the present day, as opposed to the what it was like and what happened part of people's stories. Those are really juicy. And even the guy with one day of sobriety can claim, well, what was it like, part of his story, because it was just that way yesterday. What happened? Well, I stopped drinking, came to a meeting last night. And what it's like today, well, I'm sitting in a noon meeting and I'm sober. That's an entire story. It's when people have years of sobriety and they're talking about what it was like and what happened part for 90% of their presentation, and then they tack on 5 or 10 minutes of what it's been like since. The what it's been like since is such an overwhelmingly large part compared to the 1 day, 1 minute, 1 hour episode of going into AA and experiencing that. See, so otherwise, I think what happens is people lose sight of the fact that the reason AA works is because it continues to work in people's lives at all different stages of their lives.
Right.
I want to know about the challenges and the tragedies and the triumphs and other things in people's lives in the period of sobriety, so that people listening can be inspired that, oh my God, that guy got through that and he's still sober. Wow, I didn't ever thought about that. Or this woman did this for this other person and it made a difference in their life. Gee, maybe I'll try that.
Right. I guess all the experience, strength, and hope really resides in the, from day one, picking up that first desired chip through whatever period of time they're sober.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it, and that's where I think the personal enrichment part of the program comes from. One of the things I've noticed over the years is that treatment centers are really good at getting people sober and even introducing them to AA for the first time, or maybe they're bringing meetings in or they're going to meetings out in the community. So why do people so often slip? And I think it's because the handoff between the rehab and AA, the handoff is not conducive to the person sticking around. People don't get acclimated and attached to AA sufficient to understand that AA isn't about just stopping drinking. You're drinking, you're not drinking. But once that happens, okay, now what? The now what part of that is, what do I do with my life now? How do I stay sober and raise a family, get an education, deal with difficulties, have a happy life? I've been so miserable with alcohol. How is this going to help me? It's almost like a life enrichment program, but you have to be sober to get it.
Sober and willing, I guess.
Well, sober and willing. AA is for people who want it, not who need it.
When you mentioned earlier, the process of interviewing people and sort of probing into some of these more enriching parts of their story, is there a process or something you go through prior to an interview with someone to prepare yourself?
Because I like to keep the interviews fresh and free-flowing, I typically review what I'm going to be doing, but I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that person's story because I want to listen with ears that have heard it for the first time. In fact, one of the most difficult things for me to do is to interview somebody right after they've shared in a meeting, because then it's like, oh, I already know that about them. But I've interviewed so many people who have been close personal friends and in the program with me for so long, I already know a lot about their stories, but it never fails that I find out certain things about people I've known for 30 years in the program that I never knew. And that particular item that I find out about them puts things in real perspective.
Right.
And I like to keep things free-flowing, a conversation between friends in the program, but I'm just more inquisitive than you are. Right. But you're the one answering the questions, not me, right?
So there's the getting ready for the interview and inviting people. How do you choose who gets to be on the podcast?
At the beginning, I tell you, the way I planned for it is I just kind of prayed about it, which is kind of interesting. What's your booking method or your guest selection process? Well, I pray about it. A lot of it has to do with people who I just knew had interesting stories. I knew you did. I mean, as long as you and I have been together, I've seen you go through so many changes, any number of which could have knocked you right down. I mean, and several of them did knock you off your game. From the beginning, I saw you going to a lot of meetings. You were working with a lot of people. I mean, the success you've had in the last several years with what you're doing for a living, it is helping so many people in so many ways. And I know that not just because of what you tell me about it, but because of I see them. Mm-hmm. You've had a big influence on different parts of their lives. That's always important to me. And so when I select people, I like to look at the people I know who fit the bill. That being said, I know that everybody's got an interesting story, and everybody got sober in a certain way. And what I would do is I would ask, like the second interview was with our friend Alex L., who's had multiple sclerosis and is in a motor chair he's 78 years old now. He's still plugging away, he's still going to AA meetings. He has to have people lift him in and out of bed and in and out of the shower, and he's got all kinds of physical issues. But he's as optimistic and absolutely centered in AA that I say, look, if that guy, I need to know his story. How does he do that? And I hear other people they've gone through a tragedy and then they're at a meeting the next day. Yeah, I wanted to interview that guy. And other people who, they didn't come from miserable childhoods and drank. They came from great childhoods and drank. So what's up with that? Why would anybody who was raised in a perfect home want to drink? I want to know why, This guy's been married and divorced 4 times. In sobriety. What was there about his sobriety that influenced all that? So there are all these questions I have, and it just seemed like people came along, and I thought, I know so many people in AA, I'll probably never run out of people to ask to interview. I say maybe 20, 25, 30% of the people I ask to be interviewed for the show say they don't want to be interviewed, and that's fine. I'm okay with that.
I noticed too there's a male-female rotation.
Yeah, and I decided on that in the beginning, where I would have a male-female type arrangement on along. And then one day it dawned on me, I was maybe into 100 episodes or more. I thought, if I'm modeling this after what AA is really like, and the actual mix of men versus women in most AA meetings, mixed meetings that is, then a third of the people should be women, 2/3 should be men, because that's the makeup at almost every AA meeting I ever go to. I can learn as much from a woman's story as I can from a man's story. And in a lot of ways, the way I've been raised, and a lot of males of my generation, your generation, and so forth, we don't spend enough time thinking about the type of issues women might really be dealing with as a result of being sober, as we are just thinking about them with other ideas and thoughts in mind. And some of the stories that I've heard from these women, they're just like you rip your heart out. And it's not because their story is any more poignant. It's just that to hear a woman go through that, I never would have thought they went through that. So that's the other reason I do it that way.
You also have guests from around the world. How do you come across these interviewees who don't live anywhere close to you or go to meetings, in physical meetings with you?
So one of the gifts of the pandemic was the use of Zoom to have virtual meetings really all over the world. I would get to know people by virtue of going to all these meetings in different places, because I just thought it was cool to know different people in different places. I just started asking some of them. My meeting out of London has a lot of people from all over the world, and including England, and a lot who live right here in the United States. I get to know a little bit about their stories. I've interviewed people from Kenya, from South Africa, from Australia, from different parts of Europe, Canada. They all have interesting stories, and even though I'm only using maybe 5 minutes of talking about their lives, maybe multiple times, to know whether or not I'm really interested in their story, everybody has an interesting story. Sometimes I'm assuming while I'm doing the interview, I don't know how this is going to sound. Man, he's really focusing on stuff that may not be that. And then I get to editing it, and I listen to it again. I thought, man, that is amazing. How listening to it the second or third time gives me a completely different twist on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you have a minimum requirement for time sober?
Yeah, I decided somewhere along the way, because I got asked by people. There was one guy in particular who says, I want to be on your podcast. And he got sober during COVID. And I said, how long have you been sober? He said, I've been sober 6 months. People need to hear the 6-month story and everything else. I said, well, that's probably true, but they should be going to meetings to do that, not going to my podcast. So I maybe it was a little arbitrary, but I set 2 years. And what I told him was, if you can stay sober for 2 years, you come back to me and we'll do an interview. And I'll ask you how you were able to do what is so seemingly impossible to the average guy on the street who's a drunk. And that is, how did you stay sober? And sure enough, 2 years to the day, this guy was back in my face saying, can I do the interview now? And I said, you got it. And I've done that with several other people. So when you see the number of years sober down in the low range, some of those people were not quite up to 2 years when they asked me to do the interview, but they always had at least 2 years in the interview.
So you find the people, you do the interviews, and then comes post-production, which I know you mentioned earlier, not having a background or technical training in this sort of thing, broadcast and whatnot. What's that like for you, and how much time do you devote to taking an interview and making it podcast ready?
Yeah, that is something that is, I'm going to need to take a drink of water here. See, this is where I'll be going in and cutting this part out.
Speaking of post-production.
I did an audio version of the Big Book where I read the entire Big Book cover to cover, word for word, first edition. It's available on Audible, and I also did the lost stories of the Big Book, which were the 30 stories from the first and second edition that didn't make it into the third and fourth editions. I read both of those. They're audio versions of that. I also did an audio version of the second edition, which I used for the Big Book podcast, which is another podcast I have. But through that process, I got to understand and got a good feel for how long it takes, how many minutes it takes, or how many hours it takes for each minute or hour of finished product. And certainly when it comes to the interviews, I've often thought, do I really need to be that particular about how things sound? If I'm interviewing somebody and they're just and they can't quite get to the point.
Yeah.
I'm thinking to myself, if I have the ability and the resource to be able to eliminate all of that vocal whatever and make them sound good, it makes them sound good. Nobody, when they go to speak, intends to speak in a way that's difficult to listen to. So I clean that kind of stuff up. And as I go back through, what I've noticed is it takes about 1 hour of post-production time to produce 10 minutes of finished audio. So in a 60 or 70 minute podcast, I put in at least 6 or 7 hours into the post-production. And then there's the additional work of writing the introduction. Even if nobody listens to the podcast, they'll know the main points, even just by listening to the introduction.
Right.
So I spend time on that. That can usually take an hour or two to do, although I've gotten much faster at doing it. And then I've got all the technical issues. I'm in a location where the air conditioning is going on. I have to clean that up. I've got software to do all that, but it's all really time-consuming. Anybody who's worked on this sort of project knows that kind of work is a time sink. I'm working on something, I'm thinking I'm only 10 minutes in, and 2 hours has gone by. That's just how it feels. But I try and be meticulous about it to make sure that it sounds as good as it can sound so that it is as listenable as can be. I'm grateful I've been able to find the resources to be able to do that. And some of it's the software, some of it's just the knowledge. Stitching them all together with the software, that all takes time.
Yeah.
But it's been a real labor of love for me in that regard.
Yeah, and I mean the tempo, once a week, Wednesdays.
I don't know why I chose Wednesday. I think because I heard years ago that you send out a sales letter, it hits somebody's desk on Friday. There's a good chance they're not going to read it because they're looking forward to the weekend. If you send something to them or the ad comes out on a Monday, they're still distracted from the weekend, looking at a pile of things to do for the week. They're not really too engaged. I thought Wednesday is the day of the week that there's a good chance somebody's in the middle of their week. They're settled in from the previous weekend. They're far enough away from the next weekend that they don't have to be consumed with thinking about what they're going to do. I don't know. That's probably too analytical, but Wednesday just seems to be the day I put it out.
Seems to be just the middle of the week. Feels right now.
In fact, I'll be putting one out later today, which is actually an encore episode of my interview with a fellow by the name of Bud S., who's 94 years old with 44 years of sobriety. He actually passed away about a month and a half, 2 months after we did that interview.
Wow.
And I think it may be the last time he ever told his story. And it's a great story. It's a great story. And the other thing is, I haven't heard back from anybody that too many people have gone out once they've done the interview, which is interesting. I had one guy tell me that his sponsor recommended when he was going through a tough time that he go back and listen to his own interview, kind of set him straight.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying AA recovery interviews, I invite you to check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing yet meaningful and engaging way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, iTunes, or Amazon. While you're there, search for my other audiobook, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories from the first and or second editions missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an engaging audiobook that brings these stories to life for AA members who've never seen them. These timeless testimonials were originally cut to make room for newer stories in the third and fourth editions. But their vitally important messages of hope are as meaningful today as they were when they were first published. Many listeners will hear these stories for the very first time. It's also available from Amazon as a Kindle book or in paperback if you'd like to read along. You're going to love it. And we're back.
So a lot of time you spend, a labor of love every week, the post-production being a big time commitment. I also know that in the past 5 years you've gone through some serious challenges, health-related challenges. How has that factored in to your ability to devote energy and time to the podcast, and what's it done for you just in terms of a sober man?
Well, interestingly enough, I try in every podcast to engage with my guests in a way that will allow them during the interview to get to know me a little bit better, and the audience will pick up little bits and pieces about me and my life during those podcasts. But the primary disease I have, which is all around this podcast, is alcoholism. But I've had clinical depression virtually my whole life. And it's been treated and treatable, but there have been times I've approached having to do a podcast with the looming depression on my shoulders and kind of weighing me down and kind of telling me, what's the use of doing this? Nobody's going to listen. And if 1 million people listen, I'm bummed because 2 million people aren't listening. And do I really want to do this? And how interested is my guest going to be? And what if he's a dick, And how am I going to handle this? That's actually been an obstacle along the way. I'm thinking, wait a second, I'm spending all this time doing this. What else could I be doing? Maybe I could be cleaning up my workshop in the garage, or since I'm retired, my wife's retired, maybe we could be doing this or that. We travel, we do fun things together, we spend an adequate amount of time, but when you're in a state of depression, you're feeling badly, you don't have the right commitments to the right things at the right time, and that's been one of the things that's been there all along. But then, just a little over 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with bladder cancer. And man, that took me by surprise. In fact, coincidentally, maybe TMI here, but the first time I ever noticed blood in my urine was in a men's room of the church that we go for our Thursday meeting.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, man, that's odd. What's that about? Well, one thing led to another, to another, to another. It turned out to be a tumor in my bladder. And as a result of that, I had a surgery to remove the tumor. There was a snafu with the way that the tumor was turned in to the pathologist to see what kind of cancer it was and how aggressive, and et cetera, where the urologist had failed to put in, or it got lost, a piece of healthy tissue, which you have to have as a benchmark. So the pathologist made his diagnosis based on insufficient data. And so what came back to me from my urologist was that I had a high-grade, non-muscle invasive form of bladder cancer. Now, high grade means that the likelihood of it recurring is quite significant, and that it would require additional chemotherapy immediately, which they do for 6 weeks and 6 weeks off, 6 weeks on, but having to do chemo for X amount of time because it's high grade and you're trying to keep it from recurring. And I thought to myself, that can't possibly be right based on, how do I know, for example, how do I know? This was an incomplete thing. So anyway, I was able to get in to see a physician at MD Anderson Cancer Center, which is like the #1 cancer center in the world.
Yeah.
And fortunately, some friends in the program, this is where people came in and helped save my life, or save my sanity, let's say.
Right.
Where people who've gone through what I went through, one of the recommendations they had to me was, why don't you go down to MD Anderson and have them check this out? MD Anderson wasn't going to let me come in because I was under other doctors' care at a different hospital. But when I told them about my concerns about the insufficient specimen and my concerns about that, they took me right away. And one of the chief oncologists in urology, he said, well, let's have another look at that sample. And I didn't realize they keep these things. And they were able to deduce from that sample that I did not have high-grade cancer. I had low-grade.
Yeah.
And high grade versus low grade is chemotherapy, 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 whereas the low grade is surveillance.
Wow.
We'll watch it, we'll take another look in 6 months, and then we'll do it every year. We'll see if there's any trace, any new growth. And I've already had 2 of those done, and for all intents and purposes, that cancer is in remission.
Wow.
But had I not known that, because of people in the program giving me ideas about what to do in their own experiences with cancer, I might not have done that. I might have just settled for the chemo treatment that the other oncologists had suggested. So in a lot of ways, AA kind of saved me in that situation. My involvement with AA
Right.
saved me in that situation. So now I've been in remission for a couple of years. Did I think about drinking or using drugs during that time? Well, I knew that the use of any kind of medications was probably going to be necessary at some point. The surgery and the aftermath of having the bladder tumor removed and what it does to your body was a real drag. And the pain that was associated with the recuperation, again, I didn't allow them to prescribe anything with narcotics or anything else in there. I got through that okay with extra strength Tylenol and some other things. But I'm grateful, I thank God every day for the fact that that could have turned out much different than it did. But what was interesting about it was I mentioned what happened. You remember the meeting where I mentioned it on
Right.
Thursdays, where I mentioned what happened and how I got diagnosed. I did that before I had the surgery to find out what it was. I did that right afterwards to tell people how it went and everything else. So people knew about what was going on in my life to the extent that those who had experienced it and gotten through it, and I was approachable enough that they could approach me and say, I went through the same thing and this is what happened. That gave me a lot of sense of hope and a feeling that I wasn't alone. And much like alcoholism, that's why we can get sober in a room full of people where we can't do it by ourselves. These men and people with encouraging words kind of carried me through that situation, which was very cool.
Yeah.
That made a big difference. So, I thought, okay, I have enough on my plate. But even going back into my sobriety, there were other times when I realized that God was looking out for me, although the outcome might not be real great. When I lost my sense of smell 30 years ago now, that was a very, very terrible thing. Losing one's sense of smell is just awful. And in fact, I was continuing to go to AA the whole time. A lot of that's on the first interview that we did. But
Right.
for the sake of this last 5-year period, I thought, well, okay, I have enough on my plate now. I had COVID 3 times. I got through it without too much trouble. I've had the surgery. I have cancer. It's in remission, but I still have cancer. I've got plenty on my plate. Thank you, God. I appreciate
That'll be enough.
that.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I know that you'll give me what I can handle, and hopefully that's all I can handle for right now. And work on that guy over there for once, and let me be sufficiently grateful that all I've got is cancer and clinical depression and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And then about 5 years ago, right around the time of the beginning of this podcast, I started noticing some shaking in my hand, and I just thought, oh, that's kind of weird. And I put it off to the fact that I work out a lot, so I put it down to the muscles in my arms and forearms and hands being affected by my workout. And because it was only happening on one side of my body, I thought, well, it's probably associated with that. And then somewhere along the way, I saw a neurologist for a lower back problem, because I've had 3 back operations, but that's in the first interview. But I went to see a neurologist, and at the end of it, he's getting ready to split, and I said, Doc, one other thing I want to ask you about. I've had this shaking in my hand. This is about 3 years ago. I have this shaking in my hand, and he said, oh, it's probably essential tremors, he said, but it's not Parkinson's, it's essential tremors. He just took a look and said that, in fact, my primary care doctor said the same thing. The shaking, don't worry about it. You don't seem to have any other noticeable symptoms, so it's not Parkinson's, don't worry about it. And so finally, the shaking got bad enough, and I started to notice some other things going on, like bumping into things, losing my balance, falling, that kind of thing, walking difficulties sometimes. And I went to see a neurologist Took 6 months to get to see the guy. He did the full workup, and at the end of about an hour worth of looking and observing and having me walk and stand up and sit down and turn and bend over and all those other things, he diagnosed me with Parkinson's disease. And I thought, oh, great, just what I need.
Yeah.
Parkinson's is a disease that more people die with than from. Parkinson's is a disease that takes all the autonomic functions, the control and planning parts of our brain that automatically know when to swallow, when to raise our voice if we're talking to somebody, or to watch out for that doorway that we've walked through 1,000 times that we don't bash our elbow into, that are responsible for us standing up and not falling over immediately. All sorts of things that are involuntary reflexes, swallowing. So what I've been doing to deal with that, there's no cure for Parkinson's. There's none even on the horizon at this point, but there's plenty of hopeful medications and different things that can be done to abate a lot of the symptoms. And so I've been in a program of physical and occupational therapy and speech and language therapy to kind of prepare my body for whatever decline may be coming down the road. And I was told that at this point in the disease, for me, that I probably had it 3 or 4 or 5 years before it showed up and got diagnosed.
Yeah.
So I've had it for a while, but until it shows up and something really noticeable, and you have it checked out. Some people go through it for years without ever checking it out. I thought, when my wife was saying, you're mumbling, I can't hear you. I always thought it was because of her mid-range hearing loss. I said, I'm speaking plenty loud. You need hearing aids. And she says, you're just not speaking loud enough. I said, that's impossible. It's your hearing, not my voice. And I came to find out that one of the symptoms of Parkinson's is a decrease in the volume of one's voice. And the reason that you don't notice it is because your mouth and your ears are about 6 inches from each other, and you've got this head that's like a big sound chamber. So if I'm talking to you across the room, it sounds plenty loud to me, but it may be at a level that you can't hear it as well.
Right.
So I'm learning how to talk louder and with intent, and swallowing, how to consciously, intentionally swallow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, whoever thinks about that?
Yeah, right.
You never think about, I'm going to chew this up, and I'm going to swallow. Because everything that is automatic kind of becomes unautomatic. The muscles and everything else is still there for you to do it, thinking about doing it and then doing it, but it's not automatic anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you were showing me before we started this today, these swallowing exercises you do, and they're difficult. I mean, things I would never pay attention to.
Well, you never realize just how much the strength of your tongue has to do with the ability to swallow. And so one of the things they taught me to do, and any listener can try this too, stick your tongue out and try and swallow. You probably can do it the first time, but keep your tongue out and try and swallow a second or third time. That's an exercise that's developed to strengthen the muscles that are involved in the swallowing reflex.
Right.
And there are other things involved as well. So talking loud, swallowing. So I've been doing that. I've always done a lot of physical exercise, but now I'm getting involved in exercise that involves balance, cardio, and that sort of thing. In fact, I think I told you earlier that I'm in a boxing class.
Right.
That's specifically for people with Parkinson's, because boxing is an excellent physical therapy. Overall, man, it hasn't stopped me from moving ahead. I go to meetings, I share about it. People always say, I'll pray for you, right? It always used to bug me when people said they'll pray for me. And I asked my sponsor one time, I said, it really kind of bugs me. Are they actually, while they're on their knees, saying, and remember Howard, God, make sure you take care of Howard? And he said, no. He says, what it means when they say they'll pray for you is that means they love you.
Right.
But it's an easier thing for people to say to each other than I love you. Because how quickly do we get off the phone when we say, love you, man? Here, I'm going to say it, but I hope you didn't hear it. No, I'm going to say it. Maybe you heard it, but if you didn't, that's okay. Just like, yeah, I love you, so.
Or not say, I love you, just say, love you, yeah.
And that's how I feel about you. I love you because you've been a huge part of my life for a long time.
Well, and I the same for you, Howard. A path we've walked together for many years now, I'm deeply grateful for.
You've really been an amazing example. I always used to say to people, if you want a really good model or example of how to work the program, get sober, and improve your life, you're definitely amongst the top models in my estimation. And it's not just because we've known each other for so long. We have a sponsor-sponsee relationship, but that's kind of given way over the years to a really tight friendship. That when we need to be doing stuff that looks like sponsor-sponsee work, you call me and you delineate that very nicely, and I like that.
Yeah.
Because I hear people say, well, I can't sponsor him anymore because we're too good of friends. Well, maybe you can, but you keep, it's like you keep your business and personal life separate.
Yeah.
This is how I treat you when you're my sponsee. This is how I treat you when you're one of my best friends. You've been really cool about it all over the years. You've never hesitated to call me when you've had some problems going on.
Yeah.
And of course, I haven't hesitated to call you. I remember succinctly when I was telling you, you were calling me every day. We were talking every day because, okay, just remember, I'm going to be sponsoring you. I want you to call me every day.
Right.
And then somewhere along the way, it was quite a bit of time had passed. I said, Adam, you don't have to call me every day.
Right.
And you said, yeah, I do. I said, why? He said, well, it's the commitment of making the call. Even if you don't pick up or I get the answering machine or the line is busy, it's my commitment to staying sober and accountable to you by making the call. And you still call me. And not every day, but we talk and we go to some meetings together. And that of course, is very cool. Yeah. The other blessing I saw materialize so beautifully in your life was when you met your wife and you guys were dating and you had a lot of challenges along the way that were influenced by the fact that she's in the program too.
Yep.
And you put two people in the program together, and no matter what's going on in their individual lives, that's a lot of additional things to think about and feel about.
Absolutely.
Is that a good way to put it? Or?
Well, it seems like people who maybe aren't in a relationship with someone in recovery think, wow, that's got to be so great to be with someone in recovery. But all that really does is guarantee that you have two people with trauma in their background, two people with abandonment issues and fear of intimacy and all those things. So while it is wonderful to have a collective process, there's meetings like the Chapter 9 meeting that are sort of themed for couples. It's wonderful to have a process. It certainly does bring many unique challenges.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that is one of the highlights of my recovery is just being able to be in a relationship, a romantic relationship, and one that allowed me to get married and stay married to date and have a couple wonderful children who are getting to be raised to the best of our ability with the principles of the program being at the foundation, and all the kindness of your validation, of my program and all that. I can assure you it's driven by pain and pain avoidance. I found something that worked in AA and fortunately have enough sense to be like, why not keep doing the thing that's working in my life? Because, AA was the first thing I ever really followed through on in my life.
Yeah.
When I got sober, and gratefully to this day continues to be something that I hold at the center of my life, and every good thing and success that I've had is directly related and attributable to the program.
I agree with everything you say about that. It's such a great opportunity to be able to practice the principles in your own marriage.
Right.
And there's sometimes I wish that my wife was involved in Al-Anon so that we could maybe talk the same language, so to speak. But I'm grateful that she's not, because she's a normie.
Yeah.
She's
right.
absolutely a normie.
Right.
But she's absolutely and 100% in my corner
Yeah.
when it comes to staying sober
Yeah.
and the things that I need to do. So sometimes when I'm in an evening meeting and people are going out afterwards, I think I need to go home. I need to be with my wife.
Right.
And I go to so many meetings a week and I'm consumed with so much when it comes to AA that it'd be really easy for me to start spending more time with those things than with the wife. And I see guys doing that. They become workaholics, or they use work as a convenient excuse to not engage. But I remember when your wife got pregnant, all the concerns that you had about that and all the fears, and I remember relating to it so well.
Yeah.
When you had your son and then when you had your daughter a few years later. It was
a beautiful opportunity in talking to you to see how you were handling it and knowing what you went through
Yeah.
from my own frame of experience. But I was petrified to have children.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know what was going to show up as their father.
Right.
What was your experience with that?
So I was 11 years sober when our son was born, and then 13 years sober when our daughter was born.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like that I had enough experience in recovery and in my personal work to know that the stakes are pretty high with kids. Almost in a way that I wonder if I would have been a bit more relaxed had I not known all the ways that kids get wounded and sort of. But it was actually my wife's Al-Anon sponsor who we were speaking with her. You know, we were still a couple months from the due date of our firstborn. And, you know, I was sharing with her some of my concerns and fears and just neurotic wonderings. And her feedback to me was, you know, you're supposed to wound your children, which I immediately halted me in my tracks. Couldn't believe it. What are you talking about? You're supposed to. She's like, well, first of all, you're a human being, so there's no way you can't wound your children. And secondly, if you don't have something happen in your parenting of your children will never have a need to develop a relationship with a higher power because you'll be their higher power, and that would be bad for their life. And it's like it really kind of took some of the pressure off me. It's like, yeah, I'm going to do my best, of course, and I'm also going to fail. And of course, in the, you know, years that we've been parents, I have, you know, failed a number of times. And also, thankfully, because of the program, I know how to clean up. I know how to make amends, even if it's to a kiddo. And so I feel like that's probably as good as it gets when it comes to parenting, you know, acknowledging our humanness, acknowledging our failures, cleaning up our messes the best we can, and then also remembering that God has no grandchildren.
Right. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's very much about modeling the behavior of a sober, strong, happy man to the kids.
Right.
Because I know my dad was never happy. I never felt like he was the things that you were just talking about, you know? So the only way I learned how to parent was from a dysfunctional parent.
Right.
Maybe there's no way around that, but I remember going into meetings early on when my kids were small and saying stuff like, man, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. You know, the kid is doing this and that and everything's going on. And men would come up to me afterwards and say, you know, you're right where you are.
Right. Somehow it always works out.
They really do. The ability now to be able to ask questions about that, and I don't always ask about people's children or spouses unless it does come up in the conversation. Because in a lot of ways that's an intensely personal thing, and unless people want to bring up their kids. A number of people I've interviewed have children who are addicts and alcoholics.
Yeah.
Some of the people I've interviewed, they've literally lost their children to the diseases.
Right.
And that's always hard to hear. But the encouraging thing is that they are active in AA themselves. Being able to share that makes a big difference.
I feel like it does, yeah. I feel like for most of us, we, like you were saying earlier, we just tend to monkey see, monkey do. However we were raised, we tend to raise our kids in that way, and it's just the generational nature of that. And in a way, for me, it's like, yeah, I've got all that generational stuff, you know, not all bad, but, you know, some of it was hard. But then AA and men like yourself and so many of the other men who were farther down the road of life than me sort of infuse us with wisdom and perspective and different ideas, different ways of being, so that we're not simply relying upon what we learned in our own family of origin, but now we have these other perspectives which we can draw on, in addition to what the principles of the program teach us, which, you know, in so many words is trust God and let go of the fear. What a difference that makes in changing the course maybe of the generational nature of not only the disease of alcoholism, but some of the other isms that most of us are also afflicted with.
Yeah. And that's very well put. As far as the other diseases, one of the things I've realized is that a lot of people I know, and this comes up from time to time on the podcast, the fact that they've been in AA kind of opens them up to the idea that they can solve other issues in their lives with a 12-step program.
Right.
And I've personally sponsored people. I myself was involved in Al-Anon at one time. I started off in Codependence Anonymous, but in fact, I stayed away from AA for 2 or 3 months because I thought, oh, codependence is at the center of my problem. It can't
Right.
possibly be alcoholism. But then someone said, you're probably an alcoholic first. And that made all the difference in the world. But I'm always gratified when I hear people talk about other programs that they're involved with. And I think that's one way in which AA Recovery Interview can kind of bridge that little bit of a gap that there is so people can feel comfortable talking about it. And whenever people mention other programs on the podcast, I'll very gently kind of walk into the subject matter with them and see the degree to which they want to talk about it. But I try not to ever do anything that's try and plug Gamblers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, or one of the other 12-step programs out there. What's been your experience with guys that you've sponsored whenever they come to you with those kind of things?
If someone is struggling with a specific issue outside of just related to alcoholism, I mean, especially here in Houston, where the 12-step community is so rich and there are so many programs available.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me personally, I got tremendous value out of Al-Anon, ACA, DA. There are, a number of programs. I probably would have joined more programs had I had the time in my meeting schedule. But, what I learned is that so these other programs are, of course, all rooted in the 12 steps from Alcoholics Anonymous. Maybe they're slightly tweaked to just really address the specific issues. But again, it's a fellowship of men and women in these other programs who are also connected around trying to heal certain types of behaviors. Why not give it a shot? So yeah, when someone comes and is struggling with a spouse or a loved one who's active in their addiction, or they're personally struggling with issues from their childhood, or with money, or with relationship issues, why not avail ourselves of all that's available, especially when we have access to it in this community? And I know, again, another benefit of the pandemic has been the accessibility of these other programs on Zoom. Now, I would never suggest, because it wasn't my experience, to stop going to AA. I feel like AA is the mothership. I need that. None of this other stuff matters if I'm not sober. So AA is at my core and foundation, and I never want to drop those meetings or that program. But to add in, as time allows, these other programs have been immensely beneficial to my recovery. It's given me a more comfortable sobriety to address some of these other issues that often do accompany people with alcoholism.
I agree. And typically when you're going into an AA, you're usually dragging the other issues in there with you.
Well, yeah.
It's the degree to which you can talk about those issues in an AA meeting that's made other programs so necessary.
Right.
In the early years of my sobriety in AA, when you were sitting in a meeting, you brought up being a pothead or addicted to crack cocaine, the old timers would say, "Oh no, go elsewhere." And I think people still do recommend it, though. I mean, but people would very innocently bring up other issues in an AA meeting. They'd be stopped cold, and they get turned off to AA for that reason. But I think over the years, the understanding nature of the program has really evolved to the extent that people can now say, I'm in another 12-step program out there, and I'm dealing with that issue there. Mm-hmm. And I deal with my alcoholism issues here, but because the programs have a common lineage, the principles are the same for both programs, it makes a big difference.
And hearing other men, especially for example, for me, it was with Al-Anon specifically, because in my mind, my ignorance, mm-hmm. I thought Al-Anon was for mostly women. Mm. If the guy's in AA, the gal goes to Al-Anon. And then to hear other men who had what I wanted and who I respected talk about going to Al-Anon and how valuable that was in their recovery journey sort of gave me permission to go and explore Al-Anon. And golly, I'm sure glad I did.
I don't think you can really count on any one program to take on all of the issues. Like, we can't count on our wives to listen to us talk about everything. We need other people to talk about certain things with, because no relationship can sustain the weight of all those different issues. Certain things I have to talk to my male friends about. They don't have a place in talking about it with my wife, not because they're secret, but she doesn't have experience with that, not being a male.
Absolutely. And of course, our book encourages us to seek outside help, and it also, warns us of what contempt prior to investigation will do to our spiritual growth. So
it will. It definitely will.
So how do you publicize the show, and how much money do you make doing this?
From the beginning, I decided that it was going to be my way of giving back to AA what it had so freely given to me. And I say that at the end of every episode. There's no sponsors. I don't get paid. In fact, I pay the podcast company to host the podcast. That means that technically they put it out there, what I produce.
Right.
And there's a cost with that and cost with other things. So I cover all that myself. So I'm not making any money on it.
It costs you money in addition to substantial amounts of time.
It does. And somewhere along the way, maybe because of my insufficient knowledge of and my feeling that I didn't want to publicize it with social media like Facebook, where you can see somebody's name and see their picture and know everything else about their lives, I decided not to do it. So what I've counted on is word of mouth. It just lets me be a lot cleaner with things. Now, if somebody wants to buy the Audible book that I narrated of the first edition of the Big Book, they can do that. And if they want to buy the Lost Stories of the Big Book audio or the book itself, they can do that. Or if they want to listen to the Big Book podcast, they can do that. But I'm not trying to encourage, people to do anything that they wouldn't normally do.
Right.
You want to wrap up?
You got anything else?
Yeah, I don't know.
How do you want me to wrap it up?
Let me wrap it up.
Okay.
Adam, I want to thank you. Just thanks a million for doing this. It means the world to me. It enhances the quality of our relationship, which has always been and continues to be quite strong. And I look forward to many, many more meetings with you. And you were an inspirational part of me launching the podcast in the first place, and having you do this, especially when you were the first one. And this is 174 episodes later, we're doing this. It blows my mind, but I'm super grateful for your involvement in it. And thanks so much for doing this.
Well, and thank you so much for, the time and effort and energy you put into this, what I think is just an incredible service to the AA community, and to, have these stories available for people to listen to. I've known people who have been in tough places in their sobriety and happen to also be disconnected from meetings or whatever, but was able to listen to a podcast, and it changed the course of their day. So those stories that I've heard are, there's probably many, many more like it. And so thank you for your commitment to this and modeling, what it's like to be of service to AA.
Yeah, well, thank you. He asked me to put together questions, and as I was doing that last night, I got an email, and talk about coincidental. I got an email from a guy. Let's see if I can find it here real quick. Here it is right here. This came in from a guy by the name of Luke. Howard, thank you for your service in producing the AA Recovery Interviews podcast. I regularly attend meetings but have a family and a demanding job. Podcasts help me supplement my recovery by allowing me to hear others share their experience, strength, and hope at my convenience, while multitasking during driving, doing housework, etc., and all at the touch of a button. Your guests are clearly engaged in the program of recovery and share powerful examples of the power of recovery. I value and identify with the tales from, quote, functional alcoholics who will themselves to impressive accomplishments, but sadly our success can mask the destruction addiction is actively wreaking in our lives. I really enjoy your work. Thanks again for being a wonderful part of my sobriety. I am truly grateful. So I just, there have been times I've thought about maybe it's time for me to fold this thing up and stop. And then I get something like that, and man, it's the fuel for the next X number of shows. So
absolutely.
Thank you for your participation, for helping me make this just a really special podcast episode, Adam. And I love you, and you mean the world to me. Thank you.
I love you, Howard. Thank you so much.
Well, my friends, that's it for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. Thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed the interviews in this podcast series, will you do a little service work by spreading the word about this rich and meaningful listening experience? This show is another helping hand of AA we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. AA Recovery Interviews is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all other podcast providers. Or visit our website, aarecoveryinterviews.com, where you can listen to every episode of AA Recovery Interviews. And if you want to contact me directly with any comments or suggestions, simply email Howard at aarecoveryinterviews.com. Please also take a minute to leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs, and no one receives financial gain from the show. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.